Here we move on to the next chapter, interdependence and the gains from trade. The key here is that because we all depend on each other for goods and services from other places and other people, we are all interdependent, and therefore we have a gain to our welfare when we trade. Okay? So every day you consume goods from people you've never met. Here's a picture of a guy. We have a cell phone from Taiwan, coffee from Kenya, dress shirt from China, hair gel from Cleveland, Ohio. If we did not depend on trade in order to get these goods, we'd be a bunch of poorly dressed, not able to drink coffee people with messy hair and with no cell phones, because we're not able to produce these goods ourselves. Okay, the concept of trade is not necessarily bad. It's really, really powerful idea to increase our social welfare. Okay, so remember, one of the 10 principles from chapter 1, trade can make everybody better off, and just like I promised during that lecture, we will talk more about it, and we're going to talk about it now. So here's why why we want to have trade. Okay, so we're going to talk about two countries, and we're going to talk about them, U.S. and Japan. This is, again, just another model. This is a model of trade. This is an oversimplified account of the real world. And you know what? Just because we're talking about trade and we're talking about two countries here, the same ideas hold with two individuals or two firms. Okay, this doesn't just have to be with countries. And in order to make it simple, remember this is a simplified model, we're only going to have two goods that they produce, computers and wheat. This is the exact same model that we learned using the PPF last chapter. Okay, one resource, which is labor, and it's measured in hours. Okay, and so we're going to look at how much each country produces. And then we're going to look at how happy the people are if there's no trade, and then we'll go back and look at how happy the people are if it trades. All right, so let's go ahead and draw the PPF of the U.S. This is exactly the same as we did last chapter, so we'll go over it rather rapidly. Okay. 500 computers or 5,000 tons of wheat or any combination along there. It's the exact same PPF as last chapter. All right, so without trade, let's just suppose they split it half and half. Half of their labor hours they dedicate to wheat, half of the labor hours they dedicate to computers, and therefore 25,000 labor hours to each of those goods. We are at this point. So they both produce and consume 250 computers and 2,500 tons of wheat. Because they're not trading, they're going to consume or eat exactly what they produce. All right, so now I want you to go ahead and draw Japan's PPF. This is exactly like we did last chapter in chapter 2, but I want you to do it for your own self, okay? Make sure you put your computers on the x-axis, just like we did for the United States. Draw this for yourself, and then unpause, and you can see what I have. All right, so here's what I have for Japan. Okay, if they just produce computers, right, they have only enough labor hours to make 240 computers. That comes from 30,000 hours a month. Okay, 30,000 hours a month, like I said, divided by 125 hours for computers per computer will give us this point here. Okay, 240 computers. If we do the exact same math, we get 1,200 tons of wheat. They can produce anywhere along the PPF. Remember, anywhere that I produce along here, this is known as the, well, right on the line, is efficient. This is all attainable, but it's not efficient because they can still produce more. So we would expect seeing someone, Japan, produce and consume somewhere exactly along the PPF. Okay, let's just go ahead and imagine that without trade they do half and half also. So they're going to produce and consume exactly at that point. Half of their hours spent to wheat and half of their hours spent to computers, and then they consume everything they produced. All right, so they're at that point. So without trade, here's a little summary. U.S. consumers get 250 computers and 2,500 tons of wheat, and Japan gets the numbers shown. And now what we're going to do is imagine that they can trade and see if they're better off under trade, okay? But first, before we see what they can eat or what they consume under the trading scheme, we need to see how much is produced. All right, so go ahead and put this on your PPFs that you have already drawn in your handout notes, which should already have axes on them, x and y axes to do this. Suppose that the U.S. produces 3,400 tons of wheat. We're just going to suppose that under the trading scheme that they're deciding to produce 3,400 tons of wheat. You need to label that point appropriately so you can know exactly how much wheat and computers they will produce. Suppose Japan is producing 240 computers. We're just going to make up this point right here to illustrate the concept, but how much computers and wheat if Japan is producing 240 computers, okay? So let's look at this. This is the U.S. production with trade notice. Okay, they haven't traded yet. This is just how much they're going to produce with the idea that they will trade here in a second. Okay, so this is step one. We're going to go ahead and look at how much they produce. Remember, I asked you to put a point at 3,400 and 160. They cannot produce outside of their PPF because it's not attainable. Okay, so the U.S. is at this point with trade. They haven't traded yet, but they're about to trade. Japan, they remember they were going to make 240 computers. That's this point right here. They make all computers and no wheat. They haven't yet traded yet because you might be thinking, well, what are the Japanese people going to eat if not wheat? They haven't traded yet. They will trade here in a second, okay? But before we talk about trade, we need to define exactly what I'm talking about, okay? Exports are things that you send out of the country. Imports are things that you bring into the country. All right, now that we have those words defined, let's go ahead and say the United States is exporting 700 tons of wheat to Japan and importing 110 computers. Okay, and then Japan just has the opposite numbers. They import whatever the U.S. exports. So there's only two countries in this model. These are the only two countries in the world. So everything U.S. exports, Japan imports. So I want you to plot this combination on the U.S. PPF of how much is consumed in the U.S. So now we're talking about how much is consumed. Earlier you had put the point on the PPF where they were producing. Now I want how much each of the consumers are consuming. Remember, the U.S. gets to consume all of the computers that it makes plus some of the computers that come in from Japan. So that just gives you a hint. I want you to pause this and draw those points on your PPF, and then I'll show you the right answer. All right, so here's with trade. Remember, they're producing at this point 160 computers and 3,400 wheat, but they're importing 110 computers. And they're sending 700 tons of wheat. So just go ahead and do the math. How much is being consumed total? You see, they get to use or consume 270 computers. I just added these two numbers. And then, of course, they made this much wheat, but then you have to subtract off the wheat they sent to Japan, and they're left with 2,700. So if we graph that, we come to this point. Here's the point right here you should have. I want you to notice something very, very interesting. This point is outside the old PPF. Remember, like we talked about last chapter, this is the attainable points. We just went ahead and consumed, the United States is consuming a point that is outside the old PPF. So we're able to consume more than is physically possible without trade. Okay, so in the very least, trade has made United States better off. All right, let's clear this and let's go to the next country, Japan. Let's do the same math. They made 240 computers, they imported 700 wheat, they sent 110 computers out to America, and they're consuming at this point. All right, this is also very interesting. So there's 2 points. Here's the point that they produced at, but then after the imports and the exports here, they're able to consume or utilize this point. You see, I hope you see that this is also unattainable without trade. Both countries are now consuming in the area that we said was impossible without trade. So it really looks like both countries sure might be better off with trade. All right, so let's just put this in a comparison. Remember, without trade, U.S. was utilizing 250 computers, with trade 270. That is a gain of 20, and the same thing with wheat, they're gaining 200. Japan, okay, they actually have a gain on both computers and wheat. Now those production points, remember, we just made them up, but the illustration is that trade can, if done right, trade can make everybody better off. All right, so how does this happen? There's two concepts. One of them is called absolute advantage. Please memorize this. It is the ability to produce the same good with fewer inputs. Okay, so this is one idea I want you to understand. The United States has an absolute advantage in wheat. All right, it only takes 10 labor hours to make wheat versus 25 in Japan. So you should start thinking, maybe we should be having United States make some wheat because they're good at it. And in the case that each country has an absolute advantage, which is what I have written down here, if one country has an absolute advantage in one good and another country has an absolute advantage in another good, they should just specialize and produce only in what they have an absolute advantage of, and then trade. Okay? But is that necessarily the case of what's going on here? Let's see what country has an absolute advantage in computers. Remember, the United States we know already it has an absolute advantage in wheat. In computers, let's see, 125 labor hours in Japan, but only 100 in the US. Goodness, the United States has an absolute advantage in both goods, all right? So what I told you last slide, that if each country has an absolute advantage in different goods, they should just specialize in those goods. That's a great idea, but it won't work in this situation. The United States has an absolute advantage in both. So we want to know, why is Japan specializing in computers? Okay, there's another concept besides absolute advantage which is going to give us the answer. All right. I want you to start thinking about this thing called opportunity cost again. Remember, this is really important in economics. Opportunity cost. How much does it cost to make a computer in terms of how much of the other good do you have to give up? Remember, I told you last chapter, chapter 2, that the cost of a computer, we don't measure it in dollars, we measure it in tons of wheat, because those are the only two goods produced in that society. So I want to look at the cost of a computer in terms of wheat. So if you can make a computer for less wheat, you can think of that as it's cheaper to make a computer in that place, and it's called a comparative advantage because I have a lower opportunity cost. So now let's ask this question, not which country has the absolute advantage, but now I'm asking which country has the comparative advantage in computers. So we know how to do that. Let's determine the opportunity cost by drawing the PPFs. Okay? Look right here. The opportunity cost is 10 tons of wheat in the United States because one computer requires 100 labor hours, which could instead produce 10 tons of wheat. So a computer costs 10 tons of wheat in the United States, but in Japan it only costs 5 tons of wheat because even though the computer requires more labor hours, the number of labor hours required for wheat is also different as well. Therefore, Japan, it's actually cheaper, quote, cheaper to make a computer in Japan, even though it takes more labor hours total and it takes more people, more hours, they get to give up less wheat. So Japan has a comparative advantage in computers. And this is really important. Absolute advantage is not necessary for comparative advantage. Every country has a comparative advantage, okay? Even though United States, it has this absolute advantage, they are better at making both computers and wheat, all right? Even though they have an absolute advantage in both goods, they do not have a comparative advantage in both goods. This will actually never happen. A country will never have a comparative advantage in both goods. The comparative advantage is always split. One country has one comparative advantage and the other country has the comparative advantage in the other good. Very important to remember. Okay? So what we do is we assign what other country has a comparative advantage in a good, we assign that country to produce that good. And when that happens, the economic pie, the quote economic pie, or the amount of production increases. Remember, I called this efficiency back in chapter 1. All right, and also, like I already said earlier in this slideshow, the same idea applies to people as well as countries. Trade also can, anything on the individual level, it will work. All right, so let's do this problem. Argentina and Brazil have 10,000 hours of labor per month, and here is how much it costs in terms of labor hours for coffee and wine. I want you to think about what country has an absolute advantage in the production of coffee. Okay, so remember, absolute advantage, if I had asked you to find that, I would say, look, coffee takes 2 hours here, and coffee takes 1 hour here. So clearly, Brazil has an absolute advantage in making coffee because it can make coffee quicker, okay? However, that's not what I've asked, because we know really what's important is the comparative advantage, because in order to determine who should make what and then trade, we want each country to make the thing for which they have a comparative advantage. So comparative advantage, I want to know how much does coffee cost in terms of wine. How much wine do I need to give up in order to get 1 pound of coffee, all right? So I want you to go ahead and figure that out for both countries and see in which country coffee is cheaper, not in terms of labor hours, because that would be an absolute advantage, but in terms of bottles of wine that you have to give up, that would be comparative advantage. All right, go ahead and pause this, figure it out, and then go to the next slide. So here's the answer. Brazil has an absolute advantage in coffee. So if you produce a pound of coffee, it requires 1 labor hour in Brazil, but 2 in Argentina. That's what I told you last slide. That's not the actual question that we were trying to find out. That's just the absolute advantage. The comparative advantage is what we want to know. Argentina is the one that has the comparative advantage in wine because the opportunity cost of wine is 2 pounds of coffee, because 4 labor hours are required to make wine, which 4 labor hours in Argentina could make 2 pounds of coffee. Okay, and you just get those numbers from looking at the previous slide. You can rewind and check that out. So therefore, Brazil has an opportunity cost of wine is 5 pounds of coffee. So Argentina has a comparative advantage in wine, and therefore they should produce wine. Brazil now has an opportunity cost that is lower for coffee. So Brazil has a comparative advantage in coffee.